Hello, thank you for joining us today on our presentation on the future and history of Social Security. My name is Isam Mizada, and today I'll be interviewing John Mail.
Thank you, Isa. I appreciate the invitation to appear today.
Great, so I'll just be asking you a few questions on the history of Social Security. Let us begin with the first question.
Okay.
The Social Security program has a pretty long history. Can you tell us a little about how the program got its start?
Sure. So the program got its starts in the 1930s in the Great Depression. So it was obviously a time in our nation's history of great tumult. We had crushing poverty. We just came off of the 1929 market crash. And it was really designed to address what was termed the hazards and vicissitudes of life. Some terrific languaging. And those hazards and vicissitudes fell into a couple of categories. They were providing pensions for the elderly who were no longer working. They were providing public relief. They were providing medical care for people, and it sought to address, not surprisingly, unemployment. Well, the original act didn't ultimately accomplish all of its goals, so some of these things were taken care of to some degree through other legislative acts. So, for example, public relief programs in the 1930s were fairly popular, and they were fairly expansive at the time. That wasn't addressed directly in the Social Security legislation, but it was part of the New Deal, which was enacted a couple of years before. Disability and medical care would have to wait till a later date, but the original act did two important things. One of them was it established the OASDI, or Old Age and Survivor Pensions, and it also put the framework for unemployment insurance in place by creating a cooperative between federal and state governments, where state governments ultimately started to provide unemployment benefits for their residents.
How has the program changed over the years?
It's changed quite a lot, Isa, and primarily through amendments to the original legislation. It passed in 1935. So these amendments added to the program over the years. So the original program started paying benefits in 1940, and it was limited to workers' pensions. It was expanded then in the 1950s to include disability benefits, which we recognize today. In the 1960s, very important landmark legislation. It was an amendment to the 1935 Social Security Act that created Medicare, the Medicare programs. The last major expansion of the Social Security program occurred in the 1970s, the early 1970s, and that added things such as the cost of living adjustment, which is automatic on Social Security benefits. It used to be done via legislation. Now it's automatic every year. It also added SSI, the additional program benefits to the original Medicare, or to the original Social Security program. And then the 1980s saw another amendment. This time it went in the other direction. Instead of adding benefits, it restricted benefits. It did things such as making Social Security benefits subject to taxation for the first time. It also put a cap on certain benefit types through a maximum family benefit. And it ultimately raised the retirement age from 65 until 1967. It phased it in over a 22-year period. So now people born after January 2nd, 1960 are subject to an age 67 retirement, full retirement age instead of the original 65. And that was to shore up the solvency of the program.
The Social Security Trustees Report was released recently and paints a somewhat dim picture. What does the future hold for Social Security?
Well, it's interesting to note that the Social Security program has had some funding challenges from the get-go, and we alluded to that a moment ago with the 1983 amendment that was designed to shore it up then. We don't know ultimately what the future holds, but we can look back to past amendments for a clue of what might happen. It's important to understand something that's inherent in the reason for these projected shortfalls, and that is something referred to the worker-to-dependent ratio. So Social Security is funded through payroll taxes, and current workers are really paying the benefits for current retirees. So it's not as though we have these trusts with enormous amounts of money in them that are earmarked to pay benefits for John Mayle or for ISA or for, it's really a pay-as-you-go program primarily. And because we've had more current workers as a ratio of retirees, in fact, a lot more current workers to retirees, there's always been a surplus, and those surpluses have been paid into these trusts. So over time, they've accumulated money. Now, for the first time, we're dipping into the trust funds to pay for current benefits. And as this worker to dependent ratio changes from the current 25 to about 40 over the next 30 years, you're going to have more and more retirees as a ratio to current workers. So that's going to put more and more pressure on the program. It's going to raise the cost, and it's going to result in us dipping into these trusts to pay more of the benefits. And that's why you're seeing them, the depletion of the funds occurring in the near future. So the original OASDI trust is projected to be depleted in around 2034, the DI, or Disability Trust, in around 2052. But the trust, even after that occurs, if it were to occur, would still have enough payroll funding to pay about 75% of benefits. So it's not as though it drops off the cliff. It just means that it wouldn't have enough money to pay all of the benefits. The Medicare trust, there are two, and think of those as the Medicare Part A trust, the Hospital Insurance Trust, and the Medicare Part B trust. The Medicare Part A trust is actually in the worst shape of all. That's only funded through 2026. The Part B program is mostly funded through current premiums that recipients pay for their Part B and Part D coverage, as well as through general revenue. So that's funded. There's really no issue with the funding of Medicare Part B. It's really restricted to Part A. So what you might see if we look at the 1983 amendment for a clue, maybe we see an additional increase in the retirement age for Social Security benefits. Maybe we see some future cost sharing, particularly with the Part A program, which is premium free for most recipients. There may be a premium attached now to Part A. That's possible. We may see a lifting in the Social Security limits, wage limits that are subject to OASDI FICA tax. Currently, it's about $130,000 of income is subject to the tax. They may just lift that or increase that to add more funding, like they do with the Medicare program, which has no such limits. You may also see a restriction in benefits, or maybe a means testing of benefits, or maybe a reduction in benefits for people above a certain income or asset threshold. We ultimately don't know. There's a lot of changes that are possible, and the program is not in dire straits. It just needs the funding shortfalls to be addressed, and the sooner we do this, the less painful it is. So the report made very clear that while we have a lot of potential policy solutions, we don't have a lot of time to enact those solutions.
Wow. Well, I'll be interested to see what happens in the future. Thank you, John, for joining us today, and that concludes our interview.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks.